In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, the grand Hawthorne estate hides secrets darker than its elegant walls suggest. When mysterious powders, hidden keys, and long-forgotten letters surface, whispers of betrayal and fear ripple through the household. Who is manipulating the shadows? What secrets did the late Mr. Hawthorne leave behind? Chapter 1. A curious disturbance at the Hawthorne estate. The village of St. Mary Mead on most mornings awoke with a sort of unhurried dignity, as though time itself politely paused at its hedgerows before proceeding. The chimneys breathed their faint curls of smoke into the crisp dawn air. The sparrows fluttered about the eaves with their usual self-importance, and the small collection of cottages, each a slightly different shade of cream or gray, sat with the contentment of buildings that had seen many a generation come and go. On such a morning, Miss Jane Marple stood by her sitting-room window, gently stirring a cup of tea as she observed her garden with the fond attention one usually reserves for old friends. The roses had taken splendidly that year, particularly the pink bath variety, and the lavender hedges promised to be equally forgiving with their bloom. It was, in every respect, the sort of morning that promised nothing more dramatic than a robin quarreling with a blackbird over a breadcrumb. And yet, Miss Marple's blue eyes, keen, clear, softly wrinkled at the corners, narrowed ever so slightly as a curious rumble trembled faintly through the air. It was subtle and distant but noticeable nonetheless, a vibration that seemed wholly out of place in the gentle countryside. She set her teacup down, the delicate porcelain clicking softly against the saucer, and tilted her head toward the window. Was that shouting, or merely the wind carrying voices from the lanes beyond? St. Mary Mead was not the sort of village where raised voices were common. Disagreements were generally whispered behind lace curtains or expressed in strongly worded comments about the freshness of scones at the Women's Institute bake table. Anything louder was unusual enough to draw one's interest, and Miss Marple's interest, once piqued, was rarely anything short of a full investigation. The peculiar sound came again, this time unmistakable, a distant clatter as though something heavy had fallen or been struck. Then another voice, alarmed. Miss Marple glanced at her mantel clock. 8:30. Too early for any of the daily deliveries, far too early for the sort of commotion she now heard. Her mind flicked, as it frequently did, to patterns. Human behavior, household rhythm, the little irregularities that suggested something was amiss. And this morning, something was decidedly amiss. It was then that she noticed young Tommy Simpkins pelting down the lane, breathless and red-faced in the unmistakable manner of boys who had just encountered something deliciously dramatic. He spotted Miss Marple in her window and waved his arms with the urgency of a small semaphore station being operated by an overexcited sailor. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple!" he shouted, slowing only enough not to skid directly into her gate. "Something's happened. Something big." Miss Marple stepped out into her garden, fastening her pale blue cardigan. "Now, Tommy," she said gently with the tone one uses for children and occasionally overexcited vicars, "one mustn't shout so early in the morning. What is all this fuss about?" Tommy gulped down air, pushing his glasses up his nose. "It's the Hawthorne estate, miss. There's been well, I don't know, but everyone's saying Mrs. Price said, well, you should come." The Hawthorne estate sat just beyond the northern edge of the village, a grand property belonging to the Hawthorne family for generations. A manor of considerable elegance, it had long been the subject of whispered admiration among the villagers. It boasted wide lawns, a private lake, and a long drive flanked by elm trees. Recently it had been inherited by the late Colonel Geoffrey Hawthorne's nephew, Mr. Edmund Hawthorne, a quiet and somewhat brooding man in his early 40s who had moved in only months earlier. Ever since, the estate had seemed unusually busy with visitors, deliveries, and the sort of hush-hush activity that inevitably stirred curiosity. "Something's happened at the estate, you say?" Miss Marple's tone was soft, but her mind sharpened instantly. Tommy nodded vigorously. "Yes. The groundskeeper said there was a terrible crash and, well, people are saying someone's hurt." "Dear me." Miss Marple's concern deepened, though she maintained her gentle composure. "Very well, Tommy. I suppose it would be irresponsible not to check on the situation." Tommy practically bounced in place. "I knew you'd come, miss." Miss Marple, despite her age, walked briskly, one would almost say purposefully, with Tommy trailing beside her like a small, excited terrier. As they made their way through the village, more murmurs drifted from doorways and garden gates. Mrs. Hartwell, arranging dahlias in a vase by her window, called out, "Terrible business up at the estate, Miss Marple, terrible," to which Miss Marple simply nodded and continued. As she approached the wrought iron gates of the Hawthorne estate, she noticed several villagers clustered nearby, speaking in hushed tones. The tall gates were open, and just beyond them, on the wide gravel drive, stood Mr. Edmund Hawthorne himself, tall, sandy-haired, pale-faced, with an air of palpable distress. Beside him, clutching her handbag as if it might run off without her, stood Mrs. Agatha Flint, the estate housekeeper, her gray hair pinned in a severe bun and her expression pinched with worry. Detective Inspector Harold Crayford was already on the scene, a stocky man with a mustache as thick as his patience was thin. Miss Marple had encountered him before and found him competent enough, though inclined to overlook the smaller details that often proved crucial. "Edmund," Miss Marple greeted as she approached, her voice warm. "Tommy here mentioned there's been an incident." Mr. Hawthorne exhaled shakily. "Miss Marple, yes, I'm afraid something rather dreadful has happened. In the West Conservatory." He gestured helplessly toward the manor. "I hardly know how to explain it." Inspector Crayford straightened upon seeing her. "Miss Marple, I should have guessed you'd be among the first to arrive." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of interfering, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with innocent sincerity. "But I do believe I may be of some comfort." Crayford grunted, knowing well enough that Miss Marple's idea of comfort often meant noticing details that he himself had missed. Still, he didn't object. "Very well," he said, "but stay back for now." Mrs. Flint clasped her hands. "Miss Marple, it's awful. I've been with the Hawthorne family since the Colonel's time, and I've never—" "Agatha," Edmund interrupted, rubbing his forehead. "Just let Inspector Crayford handle it." "What exactly has happened, Mr. Hawthorne?" Miss Marple asked gently. "It's the estate ledger," he said. "The old one. It's been kept locked in the conservatory cabinet for years, a family record of sorts. This morning, someone broke the cabinet open, completely smashed the lock, papers everywhere, and, well, there's this dreadful mess. The ledger." Miss Marple remembered hearing about it, a meticulous record kept by Colonel Hawthorne detailing estate business, finances, and private notes. It was said the Colonel was a man of habit and precision, and the ledger had been part of his routine for decades. Why would anyone break into it now? "Is anything missing?" Miss Marple asked. Edmund hesitated. I don't know, that's the trouble. I hadn't looked through it properly yet. I was only planning to review my uncle's old records next month. But whoever broke into it, they made a terrible mess, and the smashed glass could have seriously injured someone." "Who discovered it?" Miss Marple inquired. Mrs. Flint raised a trembling hand. "I did, miss. I was coming to open the conservatory curtains as usual, and there it was. The cabinet shattered, papers all over, a plant pot knocked straight off the shelf. I'm lucky I wasn't hit by the falling glass." Miss Marple's brows knit ever so slightly. A disturbance in a locked room, a targeted object. a ledger of personal and financial records, and apparently a considerable amount of force. "May I see the conservatory from a distance?" she asked politely. Inspector Crayford, after a moment's deliberation, nodded. "Just from the doorway, Miss Marple, no touching anything." "Of course," she replied. The group moved toward the manor, though Tommy was politely, shooed away by the inspector with the promise that "there's nothing for boys to see here." Miss Marple walked alongside Mr. Hawthorne, quietly observing the tremor in his hands. Stress, yes, but perhaps something more. Guilt? Or simply shock? One never knew until one observed longer. The conservatory was bright and airy with large glass panels that let in the early morning sunlight. Normally a place of warmth and calm, filled with hibiscus, roses, ferns, and a variety of potted greenery. It now bore the undeniable sign of disruption. On the far wall, a tall mahogany cabinet with glass doors stood open, its left door hanging crookedly from a splintered hinge. Shards of glass glittered on the tiled floor like scattered ice. Papers lay strewn about in a chaotic swirl. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, letting her eyes drift naturally across the room the way one might scan embroidery for a loose thread. "Whoever did this," Inspector Crayford muttered, "was in a hurry or making it look like they were." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Indeed, a plant pot had fallen, but only one. And next to the cabinet, a single rubber-soled footprint marred the tile, faint but visible. Oddly, no soil was smudged anywhere except the immediate area around the pot, suggesting the pot had toppled after the intruder had moved about, not during a chaotic search. And there, almost concealed beneath a fern leaf, lay a folded scrap of paper, half crushed but not torn like the others. Miss Marple quietly filed that detail away without drawing attention to it. "What time did you open the conservatory this morning, Mrs. Flint?" she asked. The housekeeper thought quickly. "7:30, as always. I'm never late." "And when was it last locked?" "Last evening, just after sunset." "Who has keys to the conservatory cabinet?" Mrs. Flint hesitated, glancing at Edmund. "Only myself, Edmund, and, well, Cole Hawthorne had one, but that was years ago." Miss Marple eyed Edmund gently. "And you haven't misplaced yours?" "No," he said with sudden firmness. "Mine is exactly where it should be." His defensiveness was interesting. "But," he added quickly, "the lock was forced. A key wouldn't have mattered." "And no signs of forced entry to the conservatory itself," Crayford said grimly. "Which means whoever did this was already inside the house." Miss Marple's fingers lightly tapped the side of her skirt, a small, thoughtful habit of hers. Many possibilities were already forming like puzzle pieces in her mind. Who would want access to the Colonel's ledger? What secrets might it hold? And what was the significance of the single undamaged sheet almost deliberately tucked away? She turned to Edmund. "Tell me, were there guests or visitors at the estate yesterday?" He swallowed. "Yes, actually, 3. My cousin Clara, who's in town from London. Mr. Bernard Cottersby, my solicitor, and Mrs. Lydia Farnsworth, an acquaintance of my late uncle. They each visited at separate times." Miss Marple smiled softly. "How very interesting." Inspector Crayford gave her a wary look. "Miss Marple, no conclusions yet, if you please." "Of course not," she said, eyes twinkling. "I never draw conclusions prematurely. I merely note little things. So often, you see, it's the little things that matter." Crayford muttered under his breath but said nothing else. Miss Marple stepped back from the doorway and turned toward Edmund with a gentle firmness. "Mr. Hawthorne, I do hope you don't mind my saying so, but I believe it would be prudent to keep this matter discreet for now. Whoever did this may very well be watching how you react." Edmund paled. "You think they might try again?" "One can't say," Miss Marple answered. But people who are desperate enough to break open a locked cabinet often have unfinished business. Mrs. Flint clutched her handbag tighter. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring pat on the arm. Now, Agatha. There's no need to panic. These things are rarely as terrifying as they seem at first glance. But even as she said it, her eyes drifted back toward the conservatory, toward the broken cabinet, the scattered papers, and the single piece of folded parchment she had noticed earlier. There was more to this disturbance than met the eye. Much more. And as Miss Marple turned to leave the estate, the early morning sunlight seemed just a shade colder than before. A curious disturbance indeed, one that promised secrets, motives, suspects, and perhaps the unraveling of something long hidden in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. Guests with Secrets. The morning's tension lingered in the air long after Miss Marple returned to her cottage. Though she busied herself with watering the geraniums and tidying her knitting basket, her mind continued to stir thoughtfully. Very much like the spoon that gently clinked against the porcelain of her fresh cup of tea. She had learned long ago that household tasks were most effective when paired with quiet contemplation. A puzzle, after all, often revealed itself not through immediate force but through patient persistence. And there was no denying it now. Something was decidedly out of place at the Hawthorne estate. She allowed herself a rare moment of pacing, only 2 steps really from armchair to lamp, as she mentally reviewed what she had observed. The smashed conservatory cabinet, the scattered papers, the singular footprint, the curious scrap of paper tucked away under a fern leaf, and more intriguingly, the list of visitors from the day before. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted through the names like a gentle breeze rustling through notes on a church bulletin board. Cousin Clara Hawthorne, Mr. Bernard Cottersby the solicitor, Mrs. Lydia Farnsworth, family acquaintance, 3 people each with access to Mr. Hawthorne, 3 people who might, for one reason or another, have an interest in the late Colonel's old records, and 3 people who would surely prefer that their private motives remain quite invisible. Miss Marple's lips formed a small, nearly imperceptible smile. Human nature, she had discovered through decades of observation, was remarkably similar to her rose bushes, prickly, layered, and occasionally hiding the odd thorn in plain daylight. A soft knock at her door interrupted her musings. "Miss Marple?" came a familiar voice, Mrs. Hartwell, the vicar's wife. Miss Marple opened the door to find the well-meaning woman standing with a basket of blackberry scones and an expression of dramatic distress. "Oh, Miss Marple, I do hope you're all right. I saw you heading toward the estate earlier, and I've been positively in a state since. Such terrible business, isn't it?" Miss Marple accepted the basket with a warm smile. "Very kind of you, Mrs. Hartwell. And yes, it was quite the unusual scene, but I dare say things may not be as dreadful as they first appear." Mrs. Hartwell sighed deeply, placing a hand over her heart. "Still, one never knows what sort of people wander about these days. I keep telling Harold we must get stronger locks. Why, just last week I thought I heard footsteps outside our window at night, although Harold insists it was a hedgehog." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Hedgehogs are terribly misunderstood creatures." Mrs. Hartwell nodded emphatically. "Well, I shan't trouble you further, but do take care, Miss Marple. There's mischief abroad, mark my words." She bustled off, leaving Miss Marple with scones and a fresh swirl of contemplation. By 11:30, Miss Marple had resolved to take a gentle stroll back toward the village green. Not to pry, of course, but simply to observe. In St. Mary Mead, people talked, and when something unusual occurred, they talked even more. She ambled toward the high street, nodding politely to Major Henry Lightfoot outside the post office, who was loudly complaining about rationing again. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Wilton was selecting apples with the intensity of a jeweler examining diamonds. Near the butcher's, Mr. Pennington grumbled about all manner of suspicious folk coming into the village lately, Miss Marple made a mental note of each small comment. People often revealed more than they intended, especially when discussing matters they believed were none of their business. But it was when she reached the edge of the green that she found precisely who she'd hoped to see. Cousin Clara Hawthorne. Clara stood near the fountain, clutching a handbag almost as large as her sense of self-importance. A tall, elegant woman in her late 30s, Clara carried herself with the air of someone who believed the world owed her a certain level of admiration. Her sharply tailored dress and perfectly coiffed hair suggested London sophistication, but there was a nervous energy in her posture that was quite out of place. Miss Marple approached her with gentle warmth. "My dear Clara, what a lovely surprise to see you in the village." Clara startled visibly before composing herself. "Miss Marple, oh yes, I thought I should come down for some air. The estate has become such a dreadful fuss." "So I heard," Miss Marple said mildly. "And you were visiting the estate yesterday, were you not? How fortunate your timing." Clara hesitated. "Oh, well, yes, of course. I came to speak to Edmund about some family matters. Dull things, really." "I find family matters are rarely dull," Miss Marple said in a tone of gentle observation. "Often terribly complicated, in fact." Clara laughed nervously. "Well, I assure you mine are not. Just routine things. I only stayed for an hour." "Ah, and did you visit the conservatory at any point?" Clara blinked. "The conservatory? Why ever would I? I've never set foot in it." Miss Marple smiled softly. "No reason at all, my dear, only curiosity." But Clara's reaction had been just a touch too quick, her eyes too wide, her voice a fraction too high. Miss Marple filed it neatly in her mental cabinet. Before she could continue, another voice floated over the green, smooth and self-assured. "Miss Marple, fancy seeing you about." Mr. Bernard Cottersby, the solicitor, approached with a polished cane and a polished smile. He was the sort of man who prided himself on being charming, and usually succeeded, though Miss Marple had often found that men who tried too hard to appear trustworthy were rarely so in truth. "Good morning, Mr. Cottersby," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Clara stiffened at his arrival. "Out enjoying the sunshine?" he asked. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "Though the day has brought rather more excitement than usual." Mr. Cottersby chuckled. Yes, dreadful business at the estate. Shattered glass, wasn't it? Quite the commotion." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I didn't realize you had been informed of the details." Cottersby froze for a fraction of a second, just enough for Miss Marple to notice. "Ah, well, Edmund mentioned something about broken glass, didn't he? Perhaps I misunderstood." Clara glanced away uncomfortably. "Mr. Cottersby," Miss Marple said mildly, "you were also at the estate yesterday, were you not?" "Yes, indeed," he replied quickly. "Routine matters, estate paperwork, very standard." "How fortunate that both you and Clara were present on the same day," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Though I imagine your visits did not overlap?" No, Clara answered too quickly. "I left before Mr. Cottersby arrived." Cottersby nodded. "Quite." Miss Marple noticed Clara's knuckles turn white around her handbag. "But tell me," Miss Marple said gently, "did either of you by any chance see Mrs. Lydia Farnsworth during your visits?" Clara shook her head. "No." Cottersby hesitated. "I believe she arrived after I left." Miss Marple smiled politely, but her mind tightened around that hesitation. Interesting. Before any further questions could arise, a small commotion near the bakery drew their attention. Mrs. Lydia Farnsworth herself stood there, an older woman with a markedly shrewd gaze wrapped in a deep green coat that looked far too heavy for the pleasant weather. She was speaking animatedly to Mrs. Price, her hands gesturing dramatically. Miss Marple excused herself and approached with her usual gentle politeness. "Mrs. Farnsworth," she said warmly, "how very nice to see you. I believe you were also at the Hawthorne estate yesterday?" Mrs. Farnsworth turned sharply. "Miss Marple, yes, I visited Edmund naturally. I've known the family for decades. She emphasized the word as though it carried royal weight. "But I had nothing to do with any of this mess." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I wasn't suggesting you did, my dear, only that you perhaps saw or heard something unusual during your visit." Mrs. Farnsworth pursed her lips. "Well, yes, now that you mention it. When I was leaving, I passed by the corridor near the conservatory. I heard voices, raised voices, a man and a woman arguing. Terribly improper, I thought. I almost turned back to scold them." "Did you recognize the voices?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Farnsworth shook her head. "No, but the woman sounded very upset, sharp, and the man sounded frustrated." "How interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "Did the voices stop when you approached?" "Yes, immediately. Almost as though they didn't want to be overheard." Mrs. Farnsworth nodded vigorously. "Exactly. Did you happen to see anyone when you turned the corner?" Mrs. Farnsworth frowned. "No, the hallway was empty, quite empty." Miss Marple thanked her warmly. Then she walked away, making her way slowly back toward the lane. She now had 3 visitors, all with secrets tucked neatly behind polite smiles. Clara, nervous and evasive. Cottersby, too informed for someone who claimed ignorance. And Mrs. Farnsworth, who had heard raised voices, an argument, near the conservatory. Miss Marple paused at the corner of the lane and considered the village church steeple in the distance. Yes, the threads were beginning to form. Not a pattern just yet, but certainly a direction. As she continued toward her cottage, she spotted Inspector Crayford striding briskly toward her, mustache bristling. "Miss Marple," he said, slightly out of breath. "Good. I was coming to find you." "Oh?" she asked innocently. "Something new at the estate?" "Yes," he said, pulling out a small envelope sealed with red wax. "This was found slipped under the conservatory door sometime after we left." Miss Marple accepted the envelope gently. "What does it contain?" she asked. "We haven't opened it yet," he said. "Thought you might like to be present, since you have insights." Her eyes twinkled. "How very thoughtful of you, Inspector," he grunted. "Yes, well, don't make me regret it." With careful fingers, Miss Marple broke the wax seal and unfolded the thin sheet inside. There were only 5 words written in hurried, uneven script. "The ledger hides the truth." Inspector Crayford frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" Miss Marple folded the note again, her expression thoughtful. "I believe," she said quietly, "that the Colonel's old ledger may contain something someone is very eager to uncover or to keep hidden. And this break-in, was someone searching for it? Or," Miss Marple said gently, "someone trying to destroy it." Inspector Crayford inhaled sharply. "Which means we're dealing with something far more serious than smashed glass." Miss Marple tucked the envelope neatly into her handbag. "Indeed," she said, her voice soft but keen. "And I rather think the next step is to speak with each of the estate's visitors. For as you know, Inspector," she turned toward him with a small, knowing smile, "people rarely hide their secrets as well as they believe." Chapter 3. Whispers in the corridors. The path leading back to the Hawthorne estate was unusually quiet that afternoon, as though the very trees sensed an air of secrecy lingering among their branches. Miss Marple, walking at her usual unhurried pace, carried with her the inspector's mysterious note and the weight of several unanswered questions. She had accepted Edmund Hawthorne's invitation to return to the estate, ostensibly for tea but in truth to observe. and observations Miss Marple knew well were the heart of all truth. The manor's grand facade appeared unchanged as she approached, all dignified stone and neatly trimmed hedges. But the atmosphere felt different now, hushed, wary, expectant. The villagers' whispers had already begun to reach the estate walls, and inside the corridors seemed to echo with quiet tension. Edmund greeted her at the doorway, looking even more unsettled than that morning. "Miss Marple," he said, wringing his hands, "thank you for coming. The staff are in a frightful state, and well, this whole matter has me at a loss." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said gently. "Mysterious disturbances have a way of unsettling even the calmest of households." He escorted her inside. As they passed into the main hall, Miss Marple immediately took note of the hurried manner in which the maids moved, their heads close together, whispering anxiously. When Edmund cleared his throat, they scattered like startled birds. "Staff talk," he muttered apologetically. "I've tried to keep things quiet, but news travels quickly in this village." "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly, "and fear travels even faster." Edmund guided her toward the morning room, yet Miss Marple paused before entering, her eyes drifting toward the long west corridor, the one that led to the conservatory. Something about its stillness drew her attention. "Edmund," she asked softly, "do the staff often use that corridor during the morning?" He blinked. "Why, no, not usually. Most of the housekeeping is done in the east wing. The west corridor is mostly unused nowadays, except for Mrs. Flint checking the conservatory." He hesitated. "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she took a single step toward the corridor and listened. A faint rustle, a shoe against the carpet perhaps, floated through the stillness. Someone was there. But before she could inquire further, Mrs. Flint appeared suddenly from the opposite end, nearly bumping into them. "Mr. Hawthorne, Miss Marple. Oh, I didn't see you. Terribly sorry." Her breath was slightly short. Her hands trembled. And Miss Marple noticed immediately that her shoes bore a faint dusting of soil, fresh soil, darker than the usual conservatory potting mix. "Mrs. Flint," Miss Marple said kindly, "I trust the staff are managing." Mrs. Flint straightened her shoulders. "Oh, yes, miss. Quite. We're doing our best, though the girls are on edge." Miss Marple's eyes lingered a second longer on those soil-specked shoes. Curious. They moved into the morning room. The tea service was already laid out, scones, strawberry jam, and a pot of Earl Grey. Edmund poured with shaky hands, and Miss Marple accepted her cup with a warm smile, though her mind remained sharply attuned to every detail. "Edmund," she said after a calm sip, "I should like, if you don't mind, to see the west corridor again. There are small things one notices more clearly in good light." He hesitated but nodded. "Of course." They returned to the corridor. Afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting pale patterns on the carpet. And there, faint but unmistakable, was a scatter of fine dirt leading from the conservatory door toward the rear stairwell. Miss Marple paused. "How peculiar," she murmured. Edmund frowned. "What is it?" "Most curious indeed," she said half to herself. "For if Mrs. Flint discovered the mess this morning and the inspector and I were already here for some time, one wonders who has been walking down this corridor since with soil on their shoes." Edmund paled. "You think someone's been back?" "Not necessarily to the conservatory," Miss Marple replied. "But certainly someone passed this way quite recently." As she knelt slightly to observe the faint trail, a voice behind them startled them both. "Edmund!" Clara Hawthorne strode toward them, her expression a storm of indignation. "I've been waiting for you in the drawing room for 20 minutes. Honestly, the staff are running about like frightened mice, and no one seems able to tell me what's going on." Edmund sighed. "Clara, please. I'm dealing with matters of some importance." Clara opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when she noticed Miss Marple examining the carpet. "What is she doing?" Clara demanded. Miss Marple rose with a pleasant smile, merely admiring the pattern. Old carpets tell the most interesting stories. Clara gave her a baffled look. "Well, I wish they wouldn't. This entire house feels unsettling today." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Fear often does that, my dear. It makes ordinary shadows seem deeper." Before Clara could respond, a door down the corridor creaked slightly, and Mr. Bernard Cottersby appeared, far earlier than one might expect for a second visit in a single day. His expression tightened when he saw the others. "Edmund," he said smoothly, "I was just in the library. Thought perhaps we should resume our discussion about the estate documents." Edmund blinked. "I didn't realize you were coming back." "Last-minute thought," Cottersby said quickly. "Wanted to ensure everything is in order." Miss Marple observed him keenly. His cuffs were immaculate, too immaculate, freshly brushed perhaps. A faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, and his shoes bore no soil at all, suggesting he had deliberately avoided the corridor's dusty edges. "Mr. Cottersby," Miss Marple said gently, "you do seem a trifle warm. Long walk?" He stiffened. No. Came by motor car." "And yet," Miss Marple mused, "I saw no car outside." Cottersby froze just briefly, just long enough to confirm her suspicion. Clara crossed her arms, noticing the tension. "What is going on here?" Edmund exhaled heavily. "That's precisely what we're trying to discover." Miss Marple clasped her hands softly. "Perhaps," she said, "it would be helpful if we all spoke openly." "No," Cottersby said sharply. "Absolutely not." Everyone turned to him. He realized his mistake at once and cleared his throat. "I only meant that we shouldn't alarm Miss Marple unnecessarily." She smiled politely. "My dear Mr. Cottersby, I assure you I am quite difficult to alarm." He looked away. Mrs. Flint appeared again at the far end of the corridor, startled to see the group gathered. She clutched a folded apron, hiding something behind it, something bulky, perhaps. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. 3 visitors with evasive answers, a housekeeper hiding something, and corridors whispering, quite literally, with secrets. Yes, Miss Marple thought calmly, this mystery was beginning to take shape. And the truth, she suspected, was closer than any of them realized. Chapter 4. The Hidden Ledger. A chill settled over the Hawthorne estate the following morning, despite the bright sunlight spilling across the lawns. Miss Marple arrived just as the clock struck 9, having received a rather urgent message from Edmund. His script, normally steady, had been hurried, almost desperate. Something had occurred during the night. The house felt even more tense than the day before. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant creak of floorboards and the quiet murmurs of uneasy staff. Miss Marple noticed at once that 2 maids were absent from their usual morning duties, and Mrs. Flint seemed exhausted, her eyes shadowed by a sleepless night. Edmund met her at the foot of the staircase, pale and visibly shaken. "Miss Marple," he began, "thank goodness you've come. There's been another disturbance." "Take a breath, my dear," Miss Marple said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Tell me everything from the beginning." Edmund led her toward the library. "I was here late last night going through some of my father's papers. I heard footsteps, soft but unmistakable, coming from the west wing. When I went to look, I found the conservatory door slightly open again." Miss Marple frowned thoughtfully. "Had it been locked?" "Yes. I locked it myself after the inspector left. But someone unlocked it, went inside, and left something behind." He pushed open the library door. On a large mahogany desk lay a heavy, leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn with age. Miss Marple approached it slowly. "A ledger," Edmund said, running a trembling hand over the cover. "An old one. It wasn't here before. I found it sitting right in the center of the conservatory floor." "Placed intentionally," Miss Marple murmured. She opened the ledger carefully. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, rows of dates, names, and numbers. But as she flipped further in, the entries became more frantic, the ink darker, the lines jagged as though written in haste. Then near the final pages, a name appeared repeatedly: B. Cottersby, Bernard Cottersby, Mr. Cottersby. Edmund swallowed hard. "It looks like some sort of record of payments or debts. But I don't understand. My father never mentioned anything like this." Miss Marple traced her finger across one particularly striking entry. A sum so large it seemed almost absurd, followed by the word settlement, and a date only months before Mr. Hawthorne's death. "There is more to this," she said quietly. "Much more." Footsteps sounded behind them. Clara Hawthorne entered abruptly, her eyes red-rimmed, though whether from anger or lack of sleep was unclear. "Edmund, is this about the noise last night? I heard someone in the corridor around midnight. I thought it was you." Edmund shook his head. "It wasn't me." Clara's gaze shifted to the ledger. "What is that?" "Something left for us to find," Miss Marple answered. "Or perhaps something someone hoped to hide but failed." Clara stepped closer, but her eyes flickered nervously. "This is all becoming too much. The staff are whispering about spirits, thieves, curses, nonsense. But I cannot deny something is happening in this house." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and panic prospers when truth is scarce." Just then Mrs. Flint appeared in the doorway, wringing the hem of her apron. "Mr. Hawthorne, may I speak to you? In private?" Edmund hesitated, glancing at Miss Marple. "You may speak freely in front of Miss Marple," he said. Mrs. Flint's face tightened with unease, but she nodded. "Very well. This morning when I went to tidy the conservatory again, something else was there." She held out a small object wrapped in cloth. Miss Marple unfolded the fabric carefully. Inside lay a brass key, old, tarnished, and marked with a floral crest. Clara gasped softly. "I've seen that crest before." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, it matches the design of the old storage rooms beneath the estate." Edmund stiffened. "The vaults?" Mrs. Flint nodded. "I thought those rooms were sealed years ago. No one uses them." Miss Marple's voice lowered. "Someone does now." Silence fell. Edmund rubbed his forehead. "But why leave the key? And the ledger?" Miss Marple considered this. "Sometimes, Mr. Hawthorne, when a person wishes to hide something, they hide it in plain sight. Other times, when someone grows desperate, they scatter clues without meaning to." She turned to Mrs. Flint. "You look troubled. Have you observed anything else unusual?" Mrs. Flint hesitated. "Last night, I saw Mr. Cottersby near the west corridor, long after everyone had gone to bed." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Why would Bernard be wandering around the house at night?" Clara scoffed. "Because he's always hiding something. The man is practically made of secrets." Miss Marple closed the ledger with a soft thud. "I believe it is time we speak to Mr. Cottersby directly." Edmund nodded. "He's expected this afternoon." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How convenient." The hours that followed were filled with quiet tension. Miss Marple spent part of the morning examining the west corridor, noting a new set of faint marks on the carpet, drag marks, as if something heavy had been moved. She inspected the conservatory again, finding a single broken petal from an orchid lying on the floor, crushed under a man's shoe. By the time Bernard Cottersby arrived, the household was brimming with anxious anticipation. Cottersby stepped inside, adjusting his tie with an air of forced composure. "Edmund, Miss Marple, I hear there's been more trouble." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. Indeed, and matters are becoming increasingly intriguing. Cottersby forced a smile. Is that so? Edmund placed the ledger on the table between them. Recognize this? Cottersby's smile vanished. His eyes widened just enough for Miss Marple, ever observant, to catch. Where did you get that? He whispered. In the conservatory, Edmund said coldly. Left there last night, Cottersby swallowed. I can explain. I should hope so, Miss Marple said gently. Because secrets, Mr. Cottersby, have a way of surfacing, especially when a house begins to betray its own. Cottersby opened his mouth, then closed it again, trapped between fear and calculation. Miss Marple waited patiently. A confession, she suspected, was close at hand. But whether it would reveal the truth or conceal it further remained to be seen. Chapter 5. A teapot full of trouble. The Hawthorne estate seemed even more unsettled the next morning, as though the very walls were bracing for what might come next. Breakfast had barely begun when Miss Marple arrived, her delicate gloves neatly folded, her expression as calm as the surface of a quiet pond. But beneath that calm, her eyes gleamed with thoughtful sharpness. The dining room was unusually tense. Clara Hawthorne sat stiffly at the head of the table, her teacup untouched. Edmund looked as though he had slept hardly at all, and the staff moved about with an uncharacteristic hesitancy. At the far end of the table, Bernard Cottersby ate with deliberate slowness, avoiding Edmund's gaze. Miss Marple selected a seat near the middle, unfolded her napkin, and smiled kindly at the anxious maid who served her tea. "Thank you, my dear," she said softly. "You look rather pale this morning." The maid bowed her head. "It's just the worry, ma'am. None of us slept well." "I imagine not," Miss Marple murmured, lifting her cup. She paused before sipping. Something felt off. A scent, faint but present, drifted from the teapot. Floral, but not one she recognized from the usual estate blends. She lowered her cup slowly. "Is something wrong?" Edmund asked, noticing her hesitation. "Not wrong, dear boy," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps merely unusual." Bernard Cottersby glanced up immediately, searching her face. His reaction alone told her she was on the right trail. "Unusual how?" he asked too quickly. Miss Marple smiled politely. "There is a faint aroma I do not recall from yesterday's tea." Clara frowned. "It's the same tin, I'm sure. Mrs. Flint—" Mrs. Flint, who stood at the door listening anxiously, shook her head. "It is the same tea, madam. I checked myself." Miss Marple tapped the rim of her cup. Perhaps the teapot was not thoroughly rinsed. She said it lightly, as though it were nothing more than idle chatter, but when she set the cup down without drinking, the energy in the room shifted. Bernard Cottersby shifted in his seat. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his own cup. Miss Marple did not miss it. Then came the moment that set the entire house buzzing. Clara reached for the teapot to pour another cup. As she did, the lid slipped almost too easily and clattered off onto the table. Several staff gasped. In the moment the lid fell aside, Miss Marple saw it. A small residue inside the spout, pale and powdery, visible only to a trained eye. Clara recoiled. "What on earth is that?" Bernard Cottersby stood abruptly. "I'm sure it's nothing, dust from the shelf, perhaps." "Dust seldom settles inside a spout," Miss Marple replied calmly. Edmund took the teapot, peered inside, and blanched. "Mrs. Flint, who handled this last?" Mrs. Flint looked stricken. I did last night, sir, but only to set it out for the morning. It was clean then, I swear it." Miss Marple reached out, placing a gentle hand on the teapot. "Might I?" she asked. Edmund handed it to her with a mixture of relief and fear. She examined the spout closely, turning it toward the light. "This powder appears finely ground, not sugar, not spice, something medicinal." Bernard's face drained of color. "You're making something out of nothing." "Am I?" Miss Marple said softly. "Curious, then, that you seem more troubled than anyone else." His jaw tightened. "What accusation are you implying, Miss Marple?" "None at all. But you reacted before anyone else realized what they were looking at." Silence filled the room, the kind that made every heartbeat feel thunderously loud. Clara stepped back from the table, her voice unsteady. "Are you suggesting someone tampered with our tea?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "I am suggesting, dear Clara, that someone may have hoped to distract us, or to send a message, a symbolic gesture, perhaps." Edmund shuddered. "A message? About what?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is what we must determine." Bernard's voice trembled. "This is absurd. You're twisting everything into some kind of accusation." "Not an accusation," Miss Marple repeated gently, "but an observation, a pattern, if you will. Items placed deliberately in the conservatory, a key appearing out of nowhere, a ledger discovered as though someone wished it found. And now, an alteration to the household tea." She paused. "Someone is orchestrating these events with great care." Mrs. Flint nearly collapsed into a chair. "But who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple turned her gaze to the window, watching the morning light filter through the glass. "Someone who wishes to unsettle the household. Someone who hopes fear will loosen tongues. Or create chaos." She turned back to them, her voice low but firm. "Someone who knows the family well." A murmur rippled across the room. Clara inhaled sharply. "Do you think this is related to Father's death?" Edmund shook his head violently. "No, impossible. Father passed of natural causes. The doctor himself said so." Miss Marple did not contradict him, but she did not agree either. She simply looked thoughtful. Bernard Cottersby cleared his throat. "This is nonsense. I refuse to be part of this farce. If you have questions, ask them plainly." Miss Marple fixed him with a serene, steady gaze. "Very well. Why were you roaming the West Corridor last night after midnight?" Bernard froze. Edmund turned sharply. "You were where?" Bernard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I was looking for the bathroom." Clara rolled her eyes. "The bathroom is nowhere near that corridor." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "And the conservatory door? Did it require fresh night air as well?" Bernard swallowed hard. "You have no proof." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Not yet." Bernard sank back into his chair, his face ashen. Miss Marple pushed the teapot aside. "I shall have the powder tested discreetly. Until then, I suggest we all drink bottled water." Edmund managed a faint, nervous laugh. "Wise as always, Miss Marple." As breakfast dissolved into uneasy silence, Miss Marple rose quietly and stepped into the hallway. She paused beside a small table where a vase of fresh lilies sat blooming beautifully. A faint residue, matching the powder from the spout, dusted the petals. She smiled to herself. "Quite the clever trail," she murmured. "But even the clever grow careless." Someone at the Hawthorne estate had escalated their game, and Miss Marple was now certain. The truth was closer than ever. Chapter 6. Confessions in the Evening Light. By late afternoon, the Hawthorne estate seemed caught in the uncertain stillness that descends just before a storm. Long shadows stretched across the lawns, and in the corridors the usual hum of activity had been replaced by an uneasy hush. Miss Marple, however, moved with her usual quiet grace, her soft footsteps blending into the rhythm of the great house. She spent part of the afternoon reviewing the clues discovered so far: the mysterious ledger, the ornate key, the powder in the teapot, Bernard Cottersby's late-night wanderings. Everything pointed to more than mischief. Someone in the estate was playing with danger, and Miss Marple could feel the threads slowly weaving together. As the sun dipped lower, Edmund asked her to join him in his father's old study. The room smelled faintly of leather and aging books, with dusty rays of golden light streaming through the tall windows. Edmund sat heavily in his father's chair, rubbing his temples in a weary gesture that made him seem older than his years. "Miss Marple," he began quietly, "I'm afraid I owe you something of a confession." She settled into a high-backed chair opposite him, folding her hands primly. "Confessions are often quite helpful, dear, especially in matters where clarity is needed." Edmund exhaled deeply. "When Father died, I didn't tell everyone the whole truth." Miss Marple did not move. "Go on." He looked toward the window before he spoke again. "My father was a proud man. He hated the idea of illness, weakness, anything of the sort. When he fell ill earlier that year, he refused to see the family doctor. But eventually he did allow someone to treat him." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Someone?" "Bernard Cottersby," Edmund admitted bitterly. "Father trusted him more than any physician." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Ah, and did his condition improve?" "It did at first," Edmund said. "He regained some strength. But then things changed. He became forgetful, unsteady. He slept too much. Some days he hardly recognized us." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Did you confront Mr. Cottersby?" Edmund nodded. He insisted Father's deterioration was part of the illness. But something didn't sit right with me. I meant to speak to another doctor, but Father passed before I could. A long silence filled the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple spoke softly. "And the ledger?" "I'd never seen it before," Edmund whispered, "but Father and Bernard were meeting privately for months. Payments, transactions, agreements. I suspect none of it was legal." Miss Marple regarded him with sympathy. "Secrets kept too long tend to unravel at the worst moments." Edmund sank back in his chair. "I can't shake the feeling that Bernard knows more about Father's death than he's admitted." Before Miss Marple could respond, the door creaked open and Clara stepped inside. Her face was tense, her arms folded defensively. "Are you telling her everything?" she demanded, her tone sharp but trembling. "Because if we're talking confessions, then I have one too." Edmund straightened. "Clara, what are you—" Clara cut him off. "Miss Marple, I haven't been entirely honest either. I told you I was in my room the night the conservatory door first opened, but I wasn't." Miss Marple remained calm. "No." Clara shook her head, pacing the room. "I was outside, in the garden. I heard voices coming from the conservatory. 2 people. She looked between Miss Marple and Edmund. "One of them was Bernard Cottersby." Edmund's jaw clenched. "And the other?" Clara hesitated. "A woman. I'm not sure who, but I heard her say something like, 'He won't find out.' And then something heavy fell." She swallowed. "I panicked and ran back inside." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Why didn't you say this earlier?" Clara looked down at her hands. "Because I didn't want to be dragged into the family secrets, and because—" She hesitated. "Because I was afraid it was Mother." Edmund stared at her. "Mother?" "Clara, she's been gone for years." "I know," Clara whispered, "but the voice sounded so familiar. I can't explain it." Miss Marple tapped her fingers gently on the armrest, deep in thought. Voices can resemble one another, especially when anxiety distorts memory. Another quiet moment passed, filled by the soft hum of tension. Miss Marple spoke again, her tone thoughtful. "Clara, this woman's voice, could it have been Mrs. Flint?" Clara's face paled. "I suppose, perhaps. But Mrs. Flint is loyal. She would never—" Miss Marple smiled kindly. Loyalty is complicated. It can protect or deceive. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Flint herself entered, wringing her apron with trembling hands. "Miss Marple," she said faintly, "might I speak to you alone?" Edmund stood. "Mrs. Flint, if you know something—" She shook her head quickly. "Please, just Miss Marple." Miss Marple rose gracefully. "Of course." They walked out into the hallway. Once they were alone, Mrs. Flint lowered her voice. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "I swear I didn't. But I must tell someone." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "You may tell me." Mrs. Flint pressed a hand to her mouth before speaking. "The night Mr. Hawthorne died, Bernard was here. He wasn't supposed to be, but I saw him slip into the master's room after midnight." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Did Mr. Hawthorne know he was there?" Mrs. Flint buried her face in her hands. "I don't know. But he came out looking frightened, more frightened than I've ever seen a man look." Miss Marple rested a steady hand on the woman's shoulder. "It's all right. You did the right thing by telling me." Mrs. Flint's next words were barely audible. "And the key you found, and it wasn't left last night. I found it a week ago. I didn't know what it opened, so I hid it. I was afraid." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring nod. "Fear clouds judgment, but clarity arrives sooner or later." Mrs. Flint wiped her eyes. "Will you tell Edmund?" "In time," Miss Marple said softly. "For now, let us gather the truth piece by piece." As Mrs. Flint hurried away, Miss Marple turned toward the grand staircase. Something was quickly becoming clear. Every person in the house was hiding something, large or small, intentional or not. The puzzle pieces were shifting, aligning themselves into a shape she was beginning to recognize. The estate glowed in the last gold light of the setting sun, casting long shadows along the corridors. Miss Marple stood quietly, her expression serene but her mind brilliantly alive. She was close now, very close, but the truth she knew had not yet finished revealing itself. Chapter 7. Secrets Beneath the Floorboards. The following morning dawned gray and heavy, a soft drizzle tapping against the windows of the Hawthorne estate as though urging the secrets inside to spill out. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual and arrived before breakfast, her umbrella neatly folded and her sensible shoes carrying her purposefully toward the west wing. If her suspicions were correct, the answers she sought would not be found in conversations alone, but in the hidden corners of the estate, places long forgotten by its occupants. The west wing had always been quieter than the rest of the house, a truth Miss Marple found telling. Dust lingered along the skirting boards, and the carpet bore faint impressions of recent footsteps, one set heavier, dragging slightly, and another lighter but hurried. She bent down, touching the fibers gently, noting the direction. Toward the narrow servants' passage leading to the estate's older storerooms. She followed the corridor until she reached a small wooden door nearly swallowed by shadows. The ornate floral crest carved into its center matched the one engraved on the mysterious brass key Mrs. Flint had surrendered. Miss Marple slid the key into the lock, and with a soft click, the door eased open. Cool, stale air drifted from the darkness below. She descended slowly, gripping the banister as she took each step into the dimly lit cellar. The flickering bulb hanging from a single wire illuminated rows of old crates, covered furniture, broken frames, and trunks long forgotten. But it wasn't the clutter that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the faint scent of lilac perfume, strangely out of place in the dusty cellar. She followed the perfume to a tucked-away alcove. There, leaning against the wall, was a wooden crate. Recent, newer than the others. The nails were too shiny, the wood too fresh. And beneath it, a small pile of disturbed dust. Miss Marple knelt gracefully, pressing her fingertips to the floorboards. One plank felt loose, very loose, Before she could investigate further, footsteps echoed in the stairwell. She rose calmly, smoothing her skirt as Bernard Cottersby emerged into the dim light, breathing hard as though he'd hurried to catch up. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile. "I didn't expect to find you here." She returned the smile with grandmotherly warmth. "One rarely expects what proves most important, Mr. Cottersby." His gaze darted toward the loose floorboard. "You shouldn't be down here alone." "On the contrary," she said lightly, "I find basements quite honest places." Cottersby swallowed. "You found something, didn't you?" "Not yet," she said, "but I believe I'm very close." Cottersby took a cautious step forward. "Miss Marple, please listen. There are things you don't understand about this family, about Mr. Hawthorne. He was not the St. Edmund believes." She regarded him with steady kindness. "Few men are saints, but the truth remains the truth, whether wrapped in virtue or shadow." Cottersby hesitated, then ran a trembling hand through his hair. "All right, yes, I was with Mr. Hawthorne the night he died, but it wasn't what you think." "I think very little without evidence," Miss Marple said gently. "What happened that night?" Cottersby looked away, his voice strained. "He called for me. He was terrified, rambling about debts, threats, and settlements. He said someone was going to expose him. He begged me to help him hide documents." "Documents such as the ledger?" Miss Marple asked. Cottersby nodded miserably. "Yes. That ledger contains transactions no one else was meant to see." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "And what did you do?" "I helped him. I shouldn't have, but I did. I hid some papers. Then I left. That's all." "And his death?" Cottersby's shoulders sagged. "When I returned in the morning, he was gone. I swear to you I had nothing to do with his passing." Miss Marple offered a small, sympathetic nod. "Fear makes people foolish, Mr. Cottersby, but foolishness does not make one guilty." Before Cottersby could reply, another voice echoed through the cellar. "You shouldn't be down here." Miss Marple turned as Clara Hawthorne descended the stairs. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a strange mix of anger and fear. "Clara, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "have you come looking for something?" Clara's gaze flicked between Cottersby and Miss Marple. "I heard voices. I thought someone might try to hide more evidence." Miss Marple gave her a thoughtful look. "Or perhaps recover some." Clara stiffened. "What are you implying?" "Nothing, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "But you seem unusually concerned about what may lie hidden under the floor." Clara hesitated before stepping forward. "What is under there?" Miss Marple tapped lightly on the loose plank. "Shall we find out together?" Cottersby backed away a step. "This is madness. We shouldn't—" But Miss Marple was already kneeling. With surprising strength for someone of her age, she pried up the floorboard. Beneath it lay a hollow compartment about the size of a small chest. Within the compartment was a canvas-wrapped bundle. Cottersby gasped. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple lifted the bundle carefully and set it on a nearby crate. She unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing a stack of papers, several envelopes, and a small velvet-lined box. Clara choked. "That box! It's my mother's!" Cottersby whispered. "This can't be!" Miss Marple opened the velvet box. Inside was a delicate silver brooch, shaped like a lilac flower. The same scent she'd smelled earlier. Clara trembled. I gave that brooch to Father for safekeeping. Why would it be hidden here?" Miss Marple looked from Clara to Cottersby, then back to the papers. Many were signed with Mr. Hawthorne's bold handwriting. Others, however, bore another name. One written in a graceful feminine script, Margaret Hawthorne. Clara's breath caught. My mother? But she died years ago. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. But her connections, it seems, remained alive in more ways than one. Clara sank onto a crate, her face pale. Father never mentioned any of this. Why hide her letters? Why hide her brooch? Cottersby stared at the documents. Because these letters reveal things Mr. Hawthorne never wanted the family to know. Debts, scandals, connections to people he shouldn't have trusted. Miss Marple lifted the final paper from the bundle. It was a receipt, signed and dated, paid to one Bernard Cottersby for private medical care and consultation. Cottersby winced. I knew that would surface. Miss Marple nodded. Everything surfaces in time. Clara looked up slowly, fear in her eyes. Miss Marple, what does all this mean? It means, Miss Marple said gently, that your father was desperate. Desperate enough to hide secrets beneath the floorboards. Desperate enough to trust the wrong people. And perhaps desperate enough to make powerful enemies. Clara's voice trembled. Enemies? You mean someone killed him? Miss Marple rested a comforting hand on her shoulder. My dear, I do not yet know. But I do know this. The truth is no longer buried. She turned toward the steps. And now, there are more questions to ask. Cottersby and Clara followed her in stunned silence as she ascended into the dim hallway above. The estate's secrets were beginning to breathe again, and Miss Marple could feel the final pieces of the puzzle shifting into place. Chapter 8. A motive in the shadows. The following morning dawned gray and cool over St. Mary Mead, the kind of soft, muted English morning that made everything seem momentarily suspended between sleep and wakefulness. Miss Marple, however, had been up at her usual early hour, already fully dressed, her knitting tucked neatly into her basket. After a brief breakfast of tea and toast, she made her way toward the Hawthorne estate once again, this time with a sharper purpose in mind. Overnight, the threads of the mystery had begun to tighten in her thoughts, forming a clearer picture, though still with several troubling gaps. But today, she told herself, those gaps might finally narrow. The estate grounds were unusually quiet as she approached. The gardeners, normally at work trimming hedges or sweeping walkways, were nowhere to be seen. It was as though the entire property was holding its breath. Miss Marple, never one to let such atmospheres intimidate her, stepped into the drawing room, where she found Inspector Graves studying a collection of papers spread across a small table. He looked up with a frown as she entered, but a respectful nod softened his expression. Though he would never openly admit it, he had come to rely on Miss Marple's uncanny instincts far more than protocol allowed. Miss Marple, he said, clearing his throat. More developments overnight. I received a letter, anonymous, claiming that someone in this house has far greater interest in the stolen estate deed than they've yet admitted. He slid the paper toward her. The handwriting was jagged, almost hurried, but legible enough. The note mentioned two compelling phrases, past debts and family secrets buried under the estate soil. Miss Marple read it twice before passing it back. Interesting, she murmured. Though anonymous notes are rarely written without either malice or misdirection. Still, buried secrets do tend to have a way of making themselves known. She clasped her hands behind her back, walking slowly around the room. And as I've always found, Inspector, motives tend to cast long shadows long before the crime itself ever occurs. Before Graves could respond, the door swung open and in rushed Lydia Hawthorne, frazzled, breathless, and visibly distressed. Her usually immaculate hair was loose around her shoulders and her gloves were only half pulled on. Inspector, Miss Marple, please, you must come with me at once. Something dreadful has happened out by the old gardener's shed. With a calm urgency, Miss Marple followed Lydia through the winding estate paths. As they neared the shed, Lydia halted abruptly, gesturing toward the heavy wooden door. It stood slightly ajar, something that immediately struck Miss Marple as significant. Lydia spoke in a shaky whisper. "I came out to fetch some old clay pots for the greenhouse, and I found, well, papers scattered all over the ground." Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Indeed, papers were strewn across the dusty floor, some torn, some simply discarded in haste. What caught her attention most was a leather-bound folder lying open, its contents disturbed. She bent slowly, picking up one of the sheets. Her eyes narrowed as she recognized the estate seal. "These," she said softly, "are copies of financial documents, deeds, wills, and here, debts incurred nearly 20 years ago." She paused, lifting one particular page closer to the light. "Oh dear. This one is quite revealing." It detailed a large loan taken in desperation by Edward Hawthorne's late father. More importantly, the loan had been secured using part of the estate that had never been officially cleared. "This is the missing motive," Miss Marple whispered to herself. "The one hidden in the shadows." Lydia, trembling, put a hand over her mouth. "I had no idea," she said faintly. "Father never spoke of any of this." "People seldom reveal their financial weaknesses," Miss Marple said gently. "It bruises pride, you see, but someone here, someone with access to these papers, stood to lose everything if the truth came out. And so they acted swiftly, perhaps too swiftly." Inspector Graves, who had been silently examining the room, now spoke up. "But who would risk breaking into the estate archives? Who even knew these documents were stored here?" Miss Marple stood very still, her thoughts moving swiftly through each suspect as though flipping pages of a well-worn book. There was Edward Hawthorne himself, nervous, cornered, and desperate to maintain the family estate. Lydia, though emotional, seemed genuine. Mr. Redford, the solicitor, had legal knowledge and access. Clara, the cousin, had been curiously defensive since the beginning. And Mr. Finch, the estate manager, had both opportunity and familiarity with every locked corner of the grounds. She inhaled thoughtfully. "The culprit," she said, "is someone who knew precisely where these papers were kept. Someone who understood their value, not for historical interest, but for leverage." Just then the sound of hurried footsteps echoed outside. Clara appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed. I saw you all heading this way," she stammered. "What's going on? Has something else been found?" Miss Marple studied her with a gentle, unreadable expression. Clara's eyes darted nervously to the scattered papers, her breath catching ever so slightly. A small detail, a faint smear of dust on Clara's sleeve matching the dust on the floor, did not escape Miss Marple's attention. "We were just discussing motives, my dear," she said softly. "Motives hidden in the shadows." Clara swallowed, her hands clasping tightly in front of her. Miss Marple offered her a kind smile as though inviting her to relax. But inwardly she had reached a quiet conclusion. "You see, secrets have a way of growing heavier with time. And sometimes people make very foolish choices in an attempt to protect themselves." Clara looked away sharply, and Miss Marple observed how her shoulders tightened, an involuntary response of someone at the brink of unraveling. But Miss Marple did not press further, not yet. Instead, she stepped outside, allowing the fresh air to clear her thoughts. The estate stretched before her like a great slumbering creature holding centuries of stories, some peaceful, some dark. She had nearly solved the puzzle. All that remained was connecting the final two threads, a task she anticipated achieving before the sun set on the estate once more. "Inspector," she said quietly, turning toward Graves, "I believe our culprit is very close indeed. All we must do now is listen carefully for the truth they are already on the verge of confessing." And with that, Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the manor, the soft crunch of gravel beneath her feet echoing the steady certainty forming in her mind. The motive was clear. The pieces were aligning. And the final revelation, she knew, was only a chapter away. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room. Revelation. The afternoon sun poured lazily through the tall windows of the Hawthorne estate drawing room, casting long golden rectangles on the polished floor. The air felt unusually charged, as if the house itself was bracing for a confession long anticipated. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner chair, sipped tea with her customary calmness, though her keen eyes missed nothing. The household had been summoned together by Edmund's insistence, yet Miss Marple knew that the gathering served a higher purpose. Today, the truth would finally emerge from its carefully constructed shadows. Clara Hawthorne sat stiffly near the hearth, hands tightly clasped in her lap. Her gaze flickered between her cousin and the door as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. Edmund hovered near the mantel, shifting uneasily while Mr. Bernard Cottersby sat rigidly in his chair, palms pressed to his knees, his composure barely holding against the tension that radiated from every corner of the room. Even Mrs. Flint, usually the picture of calm, hovered near the doorway, her apron pressed nervously to her chest. Miss Marple set down her teacup and cleared her throat softly. We are all gathered here because certain facts have come to light, facts that cannot remain unspoken any longer. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Some truths, though hidden for decades, demand attention, and they reveal not only actions, but motives. Cottersby's face tightened. Miss Marple, if this is about the ledger— It is, she said gently, and more besides. She allowed herself a faint smile. Yet it is not my wish to accuse anyone before the evidence speaks for itself. Edmund shifted. Evidence is exactly what we need, Miss Marple, but we must understand who is responsible for the disturbances, the hidden ledger, the key, and the teapot powder. Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward Clara, noting the slight tremor in her fingers. It seems, my dear, that fear has kept more than one person silent. And yet, fear alone cannot account for all these actions. Clara swallowed hard. I think I know, she stammered, her voice barely audible. I saw someone in the west corridor, late at night, handling papers and the teapot. I didn't want to believe it, but I think it was Bernard, Miss Marple said softly. Yes, I believe you are correct, but he was not acting entirely alone. Cottersby's eyes widened, a flicker of alarm passing over his carefully composed expression. What do you mean? Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost gentle. The ledger, the key, and the carefully hidden documents were manipulated to create confusion, yes. But someone else facilitated this by providing opportunities, by ensuring that certain rooms were left accessible, and by guiding attention away from the truth. Edmund frowned. You mean one of us was complicit? Yes, she said, her eyes locking on Clara. In some measure, though likely not maliciously. Fear and loyalty often make people act in ways they do not fully understand. Clara's hands shook. I didn't know what I was doing. I only wanted to protect Father's secrets, to keep them from harming anyone. I didn't think it would lead to this. Miss Marple inclined her head. Protecting secrets can be as dangerous as revealing them. And Bernard Cottersby, seeing an opportunity, used those fears and that protection to his advantage. He believed he could manipulate the family while hiding his own interests. Cottersby's hand went to his face. You have no proof. This is preposterous. Miss Marple lifted a finger to her lips. I have proof, but it does not come from speculation. It comes from observation. The disturbed dust in the west corridor, the soil on the shoes, the inconsistencies in your movements, and the teapot. Each small detail, when woven together, forms a coherent story. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Your visits at night, Mr. Cottersby, were not innocent. You sought the ledger. You checked the hidden documents, and you attempted to sow confusion so that others would believe the estate's secrets were safe from scrutiny. Yet in doing so, you left a trail. Cottersby's face drained of color. You are twisting this... Miss Marple's voice remained firm but soft. Twisting? No. I am recounting what the estate itself has revealed. Every creaking board, every disturbance, every hesitation and glance, all of it speaks. You underestimated the house's witnesses and overestimated your secrecy. A tense silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Finally, Cottersby's shoulders slumped. He seemed to deflate under the weight of unspoken truths, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. Very well, he whispered. Yes, I was there. I wanted to ensure that the documents would not fall into the wrong hands. I feared exposure. I did not mean harm, but I acted selfishly. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Self-preservation often leads to unintended consequences. And yet, Mr. Cottersby, your actions endangered trust and disrupted the household. That is why clarity is essential now. Edmund exhaled deeply. So it was about the ledger, about father's dealings. Nothing else? Nothing else in terms of physical harm, Miss Marple said. Though it certainly created anxiety and fear, which is often enough to cloud judgment. But the ledger's existence, the hidden key, and the teapot were all part of a sequence intended to mislead. It was clever, yes, but not clever enough to escape observation. Clara finally spoke, her voice steadier. And what of the powder in the teapot? Miss Marple tapped the rim of her cup lightly. A diversion. Someone attempted a mild trick, not dangerous but alarming, to test reactions and gauge who would notice anomalies. In this case, it revealed Bernard's nervous tendencies and clarified loyalties. Cottersby lowered his eyes. I see. I misjudged everything. Everyone has misjudged something, Miss Marple replied kindly. But recognizing the truth allows us to set matters right. Edmund nodded. Then, that's it? The mystery is solved? Miss Marple allowed a small smile. The mystery has revealed itself, yes. Though it is always the smaller, quieter truths that provide the clearest insight. She rose, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Now what remains is for apologies to be made, explanations given, and the household to breathe freely once more. Fear has no lasting power when met with clarity. The drawing room seemed to exhale along with her. Clara sank back, relief washing over her features. Edmund, though still uneasy, allowed a faint smile. Cottersby remained seated, chastened but contemplative. Even Mrs. Flint, who had silently witnessed the exchange, seemed to breathe easier. Her apron finally relaxed in her hands. Miss Marple picked up her knitting basket. And now, she said softly, we may restore harmony to the Hawthorne estate. Secrets no longer need shadows to hide in. And perhaps, with morning tea, understanding will fully bloom. As the sun dipped lower, illuminating the polished floors with warm gold, the drawing room, long a repository of tension, secrecy, and suspicion, finally felt like a place of calm. The mystery had been unveiled, the threads untangled, and the village of St. Mary Mead would sleep a little more peacefully tonight. Reassured that even the cleverest deceptions could not escape the observant eye of a patient mind. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Full Explanation. The morning sun cast a gentle warmth across the gardens of the Hawthorne estate, glinting on the dewy lawns and spilling through the tall windows of the drawing room where the household had gathered. The air felt lighter than it had in weeks, carrying with it a quiet promise of resolution and the comforting rhythm of everyday life returning. Miss Marple entered with her usual grace, a small wicker basket of her knitting tucked beneath her arm and a modest smile that suggested serenity rather than triumph. Today the story would be told fully with all its twists in the comforting ritual of morning tea. The table was laid neatly, the delicate china glimmering, silver spoons lined precisely beside the cups, and steaming teapots positioned invitingly. Edmund sat at the head of the table, looking somewhat more composed than he had the day before. Clara, though still pale from the preceding day's tension, had regained a measure of calm. Even Bernard Cottersby, now subdued and contrite, occupied a chair at the side, quietly listening to the soft clatter of cups being set on saucers. Mrs. Flint moved efficiently about the room, though her expression betrayed lingering anxiety. All eyes, however, seemed drawn to Miss Marple as she approached and took her place near the center of the table. "My dears," Miss Marple began softly, lifting her teacup as though inviting everyone to pause and listen, "we have now reached the point where every question must be answered and every shadow illuminated." She allowed a brief pause, letting her words settle like a gentle hand on the shoulder of unease that had lingered in the household. The disturbances of the past weeks, the ledger, the key, the teapot, and the hidden documents, all appeared alarming because of the secrets they concealed. But the underlying truth, though complicated, is not so sinister as fear had made it. Edmund leaned forward, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. "Then you can tell us what really happened?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, Edmund. The ledger, as you discovered, recorded debts and financial transactions spanning years. It was indeed private, but not illegal. Bernard Cottersby, however, believed it held the potential to disrupt the family. Acting in fear and in a desire to protect certain interests, he attempted to manipulate circumstances, moving documents, checking rooms, and even using minor diversions like the powder in the teapot to observe reactions." She sipped her tea calmly, her eyes sweeping the room. "No harm was intended, but such actions naturally created anxiety and suspicion." Clara's voice trembled slightly. "And the hidden key and the floorboard compartment?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "The key opened the hidden storerooms beneath the west wing where Mr. Hawthorne had once stored sensitive family documents. The floorboard compartment discovered yesterday was another hiding place. The items contained there, the letters, the envelopes, and the lilac brooch, belonged to your mother. Your father, ever careful and proud, had hidden them to protect their privacy. It was entirely a matter of caution, not crime." Bernard Cottersby's voice was low, almost shameful. "I see now how my actions only made things worse. I thought I was being cautious, but I only spread fear." Miss Marple inclined her head kindly. "Indeed, Mr. Cottersby, it is a lesson many of us learn too late, that good intentions without full understanding often lead to misunderstanding." She shifted her attention to Clara. "And you, my dear, acted out of loyalty and love for your father's memory. Both of you, in your separate ways, responded to fear. That fear, however, has now dissipated." Edmund, who had been silent, finally spoke. "And the powder in the teapot?" Miss Marple allowed a faint smile. "A minor diversion, a test. Someone, likely Bernard, wished to observe reactions quietly, to gauge who was attentive, who might notice anomalies. It was clever but unnecessary and revealed much about intentions and character." Clara exhaled, relaxing slightly. "So, nothing dangerous then?" "Not physically," Miss Marple confirmed. "But danger is not always measured in injuries. Anxiety, suspicion, and secrecy can wound hearts and minds as effectively as any other means." She paused, taking another delicate sip of tea. "Now, as for the ledger and the hidden papers, these documents contain details about loans, settlements, and the care of your late father during his final months. Some payments were made to Mr. Cottersby for consultations. While these arrangements may have appeared mysterious or suspicious, they were simply part of your father's desire for privacy and his attempts to maintain dignity in the face of illness. Edmund nodded slowly, absorbing the explanation. So there was no foul play in father's death? Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Edmund. His passing was natural. The disruptions, the secretive movements, and the minor deceptions were consequences of concern and fear rather than malice. Each small act, the nighttime visits, the hidden ledger, the teapot powder, was a symptom of the human tendency to overcomplicate when emotions run high. Bernard Cottersby, his hands folded before him, whispered, I understand now. My mistakes. They were born of panic and misjudgment. I hope to make amends. Miss Marple regarded him with a quiet warmth. Acknowledgement and honesty are always the first steps toward amends. You may now act with conscience and care rather than fear. Clara looked at the silver lilac brooch, her fingers tracing its delicate petals. And mother's things? They were only meant to be remembered fondly. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. They were never dangerous. They were part of a family's history, hidden to preserve dignity, not to deceive. And now that the secrets are revealed, they may be cherished openly without fear. The atmosphere in the room lightened noticeably. Mrs. Flint exhaled, arranging the tea service once more, her face showing relief. Edmund offered a faint smile, and Clara's posture relaxed, the tension in her shoulders finally releasing. Even Bernard, though subdued, seemed lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. Miss Marple, setting her knitting basket aside, smiled at the group. And so, my friends, the Hawthorne estate returns to the state it should always have maintained, peaceful, secure, and honest in its relationships. Secrets need not fester in shadows when observed with patience, care, and reason. Sometimes all it takes is a calm mind and attentive eyes to bring clarity. She raised her teacup in a gentle gesture. Let us drink, then, to truth, understanding, and the renewed harmony of this household. The others lifted their cups in unison, the small clink of porcelain against porcelain echoing faintly through the room. Outside, the sun broke fully through the clouds, scattering golden light across the lawns, and for the first time in many days, the Hawthorne estate felt entirely at peace. The mysteries had been unraveled, fears confronted, and lessons quietly learned, leaving the household free to resume life with warmth, clarity, and the comforting rhythm of ordinary days. Miss Marple, content and serene, sipped her tea one final time. The knitting needles in her basket clicked softly as she worked, a gentle reminder that even in the most intricate mysteries, ordinary life could resume its steady, comforting pace.